It was the night of April 26, 1986, a night like any other in the quiet Soviet town of Pripyat. The stars shimmered above the dense Ukrainian forest, and the cool wind brushed against the concrete buildings where families slept peacefully, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. There was calmness in the air, but beneath that stillness, inside the gray heart of a nuclear reactor, an unstoppable storm was brewing. Far away from the laughter of children and the comfort of dreams, inside Reactor No. 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a test was being conducted, a test that was meant to prove Soviet engineering supremacy. But within moments, that experiment would spiral into chaos, exploding with a power equivalent to hundreds of atomic bombs. That night would not only tear apart steel and concrete, it would shatter human lives, political illusions, and scientific pride. It would become the world's greatest nuclear disaster. This is the story of midnight in Chernobyl, the untold story of how ambition, secrecy, and human error changed the world forever. Chapter 1. The Pride of the Soviet Union. During the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet Union stood tall, powerful, secretive, and obsessed with progress. It was the Cold War era, when every invention, every rocket, every atom split was a weapon in a silent war of prestige between East and West. The Soviet government promised its people a future powered by science, clean, limitless, and unstoppable. And to prove that communism could master the atom better than capitalism ever could, they built nuclear plants across the land. Among them, one stood as a shining beacon of Soviet achievement, the Chernobyl nuclear power station in northern Ukraine. It wasn't just a plant, it was a monument to Soviet brilliance. It was surrounded by a brand new city, Pripyat, built to house scientists, engineers, and their families, complete with schools, theaters, and even a Ferris wheel for children. To the world, it was progress. To the government, it was pride. But hidden beneath the concrete walls of Chernobyl was something the Soviet Union never wanted to admit: flaws. Dangerous flaws that would one day turn pride into poison. Chapter 2. The RBMK Reactor, a flawed design. The RBMK-1000 reactor was a marvel on paper. Efficient, cost-effective, and powerful enough to light up an entire region. But what no one dared to question publicly was that this design came with a deadly secret. Unlike Western reactors, which had strong containment buildings to trap radiation in case of an accident, the RBMK had none. Its control rods, meant to cool the reaction, had graphite tips, which caused a dangerous surge of reactivity in the first seconds of insertion. It was a silent trap, waiting for the wrong conditions. Soviet engineers knew about these flaws, but they were silenced. In a nation where failure was treason, no one could afford to speak the truth. Reports were rewritten. Warnings were buried in classified documents. The reactor continued to operate like a loaded gun in the dark, waiting for one human mistake. Chapter 3. The test that went terribly wrong, April 25, 1986. The engineers at Chernobyl prepared for what was supposed to be a routine test, to see how long the turbines could keep the reactor cool during a power outage. It was a test that had been postponed several times before, but that day, everything went wrong. The test, originally scheduled for daytime, was delayed because Kiev's power grid demanded electricity. The most experienced engineers went home, leaving the night shift, a team of young, tired, and under-pressure workers, to perform one of the most dangerous experiments in nuclear history. As the clock crept toward midnight, power levels dropped too low, destabilizing the reactor. Alarms flashed red across the control room. Voices grew tense. Senior engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, known for his arrogance and temper, pushed the operators to continue. He believed the system could handle anything. One by one, safety protocols were ignored. Cooling systems were shut down. Valves opened. Pressure rose silently within the core. The operators didn't realize that every keystroke, Every lever pulled was tightening the noose around their own necks. At 1:23 a.m., the fateful button was pressed, AZ-5, the emergency shutdown. But instead of stopping the reaction, it triggered a nuclear explosion. Chapter 4. The explosion that split the night. The silence of the night was shattered. The explosion ripped through the reactor. A blinding flash of light lit up the sky like a second sun. The 1,000-ton steel lid covering the core was blown into the air, flipping over like paper. The ground trembled. The second explosion came moments later, scattering chunks of radioactive graphite into the air, pieces so deadly that standing near them for seconds could mean death. Flames of blue, orange, and red erupted into the sky. The air crackled with radiation, invisible, odorless, and merciless. Inside the plant, chaos took over. Workers screamed. The walls were on fire, the control panels were melting, yet no one could comprehend what had happened. Some thought it was a hydrogen explosion. Others believed the reactor was still intact. Outside in the town of Pripyat, people awoke to the sound of the blast. They saw the strange blue glow rising over the plant. Some stood on their balconies, mesmerized by the beauty of what they thought was a firework. They had no idea. They were watching death itself dance in the night sky. Chapter 5. Pripyat, the city that slept through hell. Just 3 kilometers away, the city of Pripyat slept under a deadly cloud of radioactive dust. The morning sun rose as if nothing had happened, but the air carried invisible death, xenon, cesium, iodine, and strontium, elements that would burn through generations. Children played outside, while parents went to work as usual. Weddings were held, buses ran, schools opened. People breathed in radiation thousands of times higher than safe limits, completely unaware. By midday, strange symptoms began to appear. People vomited, felt dizzy, tasted metal in their mouths. Firefighters returning from the plant were collapsing, their skin blistered and eyes swollen. Still, the government said nothing. For 36 hours, the people of Pripyat were left to die slowly, poisoned by the air they breathed, because the Soviet Union refused to admit a mistake. To them, silence was more valuable than truth. Chapter 6. The Evacuation. A Goodbye Forever. It was April 27, 1986, the day when the life of an entire city quietly ended without anyone realizing it. As the morning sun rose over Pripyat, a calm voice echoed through loudspeakers across the streets. Comrades, there is no reason for panic. This is a precautionary evacuation. You will return in 3 days. The words were soft, rehearsed, almost reassuring. No one knew that behind those calm tones lay unimaginable horror. Buses began to roll into the city, long green military-style buses that lined the streets like silent serpents. The people of Pripyat obeyed, just as they had always been taught to. Mothers packed small bags, a change of clothes, a loaf of bread, a jar of jam, a few documents, and family photographs. Fathers gathered the children and reassured them, "We'll be back soon." Grandparents locked their doors and hid spare keys under doormats, convinced they'd be home by the end of the week. Even the plants on the windowsills were watered one last time. The city was left neat, peaceful, trusting, a place waiting patiently for a return that would never come. As the buses began to move, dogs barked from the sidewalks, chasing their owners in confusion, refusing to be left behind. Cats hid under staircases, sensing something that humans could not. Windows closed softly, curtains swaying in the wind. A quiet, eerie stillness descended on Pripyat. The sound of engines faded, leaving behind a city suddenly empty, a city that had lost its heartbeat. The people didn't know that the radiation was already everywhere, in the air they had breathed, in the clothes they wore, in the toys their children held close. They didn't know that the invisible dust that clung to their shoes was poisoning the ground they loved. When they left, they believed they were stepping out for safety. But in truth, they were walking away from their entire lives. Days passed, weeks, then months, and still they never returned. Pripyat became a city of ghosts, a silent museum of the ordinary lives that once thrived there. Classrooms remained filled with notebooks and chalk. Dining tables were still set for dinner. A child's doll sat on a windowsill, staring out at streets overgrown with wildflowers and moss. The clock stopped, frozen forever at the hour the city died. Today, Pripyat stands as a monument to absence, a place where time refuses to move forward. The wind whistles through broken windows, carrying the whispers of those who once laughed, dreamed, and believed in tomorrow. Chernobyl didn't just destroy a reactor, it stole a city's soul, leaving behind a haunting silence that still speaks louder than words. Chapter 7. The Invisible Enemy. While Pripyat citizens boarded buses, radiation escaped into the atmosphere, carried by the wind. Within days, it reached Belarus, Poland, Sweden, and then the rest of Europe. Swedish scientists were the first to detect abnormally high radiation levels and demanded answers. Only then did the Soviet government finally admit something terrible had happened. When investigators arrived at Chernobyl, they found horror. The reactor was gone, a massive crater glowing with molten nuclear fuel. The air itself was toxic. Trees turned red and died. Birds fell mid-flight. The nearby river shimmered with radioactive dust. Thousands of soldiers, firefighters, and miners, called liquidators, were sent to clean up the catastrophe. They climbed onto the reactor roof, shoveling radioactive debris with bare hands, sometimes for only 90 seconds before they were replaced. Many died within weeks. Others lived, carrying cancers and burns for the rest of their lives. They were not soldiers. They were sacrifices made in the name of silence and control. Chapter 8. The Human Cost. The first wave of victims, the plant workers and the firefighters, were rushed through the night to Moscow's Hospital No. 6, a facility unprepared for the catastrophe that was about to arrive at its doors. They came by ambulances, barely alive, their faces swollen, their skin blistered, their eyes burning from radiation. These were the men who had run toward the fire when everyone else ran away, unaware that the flames they faced were not ordinary, but fueled by the invisible wrath of the atom. Inside the hospital, doctors and nurses stood helpless before a kind of suffering they had never witnessed before. Their medical training could not explain what they were seeing. Skin turned ashen gray, veins collapsed, and internal organs liquefied under the relentless assault of radiation. The smell of burnt flesh hung heavy in the air, a nauseating reminder that these were not just patients, but victims of something humanity had never fully understood. One nurse would later whisper in disbelief. Their bodies glowed, as if light was shining from within them. It was not light, of course. It was death, burning its way outward. They cried out in agony, calling for water, for relief, for their families, but their loved ones were not allowed near them. Wives and mothers could only watch through glass, their hands trembling, unable to hold the ones they loved, because even a single touch carried lethal radiation. One wife later said, "When I saw him, I didn't recognize him, but I could still hear his voice." Within days, dozens of these heroes were gone. Their bodies were so radioactive that they were sealed in zinc-lined coffins wrapped in plastic, encased in lead, and buried under thick layers of concrete, because even in death, they remained a danger to the living. But Chernobyl's cruelty did not end with those men. The long-term pain was even deeper, silent, slow, and merciless. In the years that followed, thousands of children were diagnosed with thyroid cancer, their small bodies bearing the price of a disaster they were too young to comprehend. Families disintegrated, torn apart by grief and illness. Villages were emptied, photographs left behind on the walls of houses that no one would ever enter again. Entire generations simply faded into silence, as if the radiation had erased not just life, but memory itself. Chernobyl was never just an explosion of steel and fire. It was an explosion of humanity's illusion of control. It left behind a wound deeper than any crater, one that time has never been able to heal. Decades have passed, yet the pain still lingers in the soil, in the bloodlines, in the very air that once carried the whispers of the dying. Chernobyl was not just a place of death. It was a mirror that showed the world its own fragility, its arrogance, and the terrible cost of forgetting that nature can destroy as easily as it gives life. Chapter 9. The Cover-Up. As the truth began to ripple across the world, the walls of Soviet secrecy trembled, but the men behind them moved quickly to contain the fallout, not of radiation, but of reputation. The government in Moscow, terrified of shame, scrambled to rewrite the story before it reached foreign ears. They crafted lies as swiftly as the reactor had exploded. Official reports were rewritten overnight. Evidence quietly vanished into archives, and photographs that captured the real horror were destroyed. Those who dared to speak the truth were interrogated, silenced, or made to disappear into the shadowy folds of the Soviet system. In the public eye, the blame fell not on the reactor's design, not on the arrogance of power or the negligence of secrecy, but on the men who had operated it. The plant workers were painted as careless, reckless, and unqualified. They were the perfect scapegoats for a nation that could never admit weakness. Behind closed doors, officials whispered, "It was human error," as if those few men could carry the weight of an empire's failure. But truth has a way of enduring, no matter how deeply buried. Years later, journalist and author Adam Higginbotham, in his hauntingly powerful book, Midnight in Chernobyl, unearthed what the Soviet regime had fought so hard to hide. Through years of research, secret documents, and the words of survivors, he revealed that Chernobyl was not an accident of fate. It was the inevitable consequence of a system built on lies, pride, and fear. It was a structure so obsessed with appearing strong that it rotted from within. Chernobyl, at its core, was never just a technical failure. It was a moral collapse, the moment when human arrogance collided with the laws of nature and truth itself. It was the silence of a government that valued control more than compassion, obedience more than honesty. It was born from the belief that mistakes could be hidden, that lives could be erased, and that history could be rewritten. But Chernobyl proved them wrong. It became a grim testament that truth, like radiation, can never truly be contained. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Chernobyl. Today, the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone stretches endlessly, more than 2,600 square kilometers of silence, wrapped in mist and memory. It is a place where time has forgotten to move forward. The wind whispers through broken windows, carrying echoes of laughter that once filled the air. The streets of Pripyat lie buried beneath weeds and wildflowers, their cracked pavements now claimed by nature. Rusted Ferris wheels stand motionless against gray skies, and empty schools remain frozen in the moment the world stopped. April 1986. Dust covers tiny desks, textbooks lie open as if waiting for lessons that never resumed, and small dolls stare from shelves with glass eyes dulled by decades of sorrow. Yet, in this haunting wasteland, life has found its way back. Deer walk calmly through abandoned playgrounds, their hooves echoing against forgotten concrete. Wolves prowl through the skeletons of buildings, kings of a new wilderness born from human failure. Birds, hawks, eagles, and ravens soar freely over what once was death itself. The irony is almost poetic. Where man could not survive, nature reclaimed her throne. In the absence of humanity, the earth began to heal herself. In 2016, engineers erected a colossal steel sarcophagus over the ruins of Reactor No. 4, a gleaming monument of metal meant to contain the horror that still breathes beneath. It stretches like a silent guardian over the heart of destruction, vast, cold, and magnificent. It was designed to last 100 years, yet deep beneath its armor lies a restless monster, the molten core that still simmers quietly in the dark, like an ember of the apocalypse. Beneath those layers of steel and sorrow, the ghost of Chernobyl still beats faintly, as if reminding the world that what was unleashed that night can never truly be buried. The true legacy of Chernobyl does not lie in its crumbling buildings or rusting reactors. It lives in the questions it left behind, questions that pierce the conscience of humanity. How far will mankind go to satisfy its pride? How much truth can a nation bury beneath lies? How many lives must be sacrificed before we learn humility? Chernobyl is not just a place. It is a mirror reflecting our own arrogance, a scar carved into history, forever reminding us that power without wisdom always comes at a devastating cost. Chapter 11. A warning to the world. Chernobyl was not only a Soviet tragedy, it was a warning to the world. A reminder that the line between progress and destruction is dangerously thin. It taught us that technology without responsibility is like fire without control. It gave the world a glimpse of what happens when politics silences truth, when pride outweighs precaution. The invisible enemy that night was not just radiation, it was ignorance, it was arrogance, and it still lives within us whenever we believe we can play God with the forces of nature. April 26, 1986, 1:23 a.m. A moment that divided history into before and after. Today, when we hear the word Chernobyl, we no longer think of power or progress, but of pain, of loss, of lessons written in radiation and tears. Because in our quest to control the atom, we forgot the simplest truth, that nature always has the final say. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because remembering history is the only way to make sure it never repeats itself.